Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the CSIS Global Food Security Program. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with researcher, professor, and author Robert Paarlberg about his latest book, Resetting the Table: Straight Talk About the Food We Grow and Eat. This book was published just a few weeks ago and has already been listed among the New York Times new and noteworthy titles. This shouldn't be a surprise, as Robert brings decades of experience in agriculture and food security research, policymaking, and teaching in the United States and around the world. Robert, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you and CSIS for helping me launch this new book.
Of course, thank you.
I was first inspired to write a book like this after attending an event at Harvard University. It was a panel on sustainable food, and there were three speakers on the panel. One was a celebrity restaurateur from the Bay Area. The other was a playwright from New York, and the third was the young leader of the slow food movement in the United States. And it took them no time at all to reach a lockstep conclusion that the only sustainable food system would have to be organic and local and slow. And I found this to be a jarring conclusion, because I just returned from interviewing women farmers in Uganda who were trapped in a food system that was entirely organic, local, and slow. It was organic because they couldn't afford any nitrogen fertilizer for their crops. It was local because transportation was almost impossible on the rutted dirt roads in the rainy season, and their food preparation tasks were painfully slow. They had to not only plant, weed, and harvest the maize, but then they had to strip it and soak it and then dry it and then pound it and then get the water and get the firewood before they could cook a meal for their family. And still, their families were frequently stunted and malnourished. So I thought later, how is it that progressive thinkers who welcome modern science in other walks of life, including medicine, of course, and also transportation and communications, why are they afraid of endorsing modern science when it comes to food production? Modern farming is dismissed quite often as too industrial or as unsustainable. And one reason, I believe, is that the sustainability of traditional farming has been badly exaggerated. It's mostly an illusion that ignores the much smaller quantity of food that we were producing when we were using traditional methods. Since 1940, the United States has tripled its agricultural output. If we had tried to do that using the methods of the 1940s, we would have done vast environmental damage. Already, when you think about it, back in the 1930s, we had reached the environmental limits of what traditional agricultural production could accomplish. When we extended low-yield farming into the drought-prone southern plains in the 1930s, the result was, after a drought, the soil blew away, and it was a disastrous dust bowl, an environmental and a human calamity. Fortunately, thanks to modern science, we started saving land after 1950. With hybrid seeds, we could grow much more on less land. Today, we're growing 5 times as much corn as in 1940 on 20% less land. Then we added other innovations, including no-till farming, GPS-guided equipment, drip irrigation, digital applications for sensor systems, variable rate applications. It was thanks to all of these things that modern farming was able to reduce not just its dependence on land, but eventually its dependence on water, energy, and chemicals as well. Most people don't realize it, but American agriculture today is using about the same amount of fertilizer as it did 40 years ago, but we've increased production by more than 40%. We're using 18% less pesticides. And in the area of insecticides specifically, insecticide use in the United States peaked in 1972, and now it's 80% below that level. So modern science-based farming is actually environmentally more sustainable than traditional farming. And this is true in developing countries, not just in the United States. It's simply wrong to say that the modern wheat and rice varieties that were introduced into South Asia in the 1960s and the 1970s required more water and more fertilizer. They produced so much more grain. They doubled yields, or more than that. They produced so much more grain that the fertilizer required for every ton of production fell by 50%. The water required for each ton of production fell by 2/3. These were technologies that not only helped a region desperately short of food to produce more, but to do so with fewer resources for every ton of production. So in my book, I endorse adding agroecological methods to modern agricultural science. This is an approach that's been favored over the years by Gordon Conway, who wrote a book called The Doubly Green Revolution. It's favored more recently by Jules Pretty, who endorses sustainable agricultural intensification using things like precision to increase yields on land already plowed so you don't have to plow up more lands. But I don't endorse agroecology as an alternative to modern science-based farming. There's simply no example of a country that has fed its people and lifted its farmers out of poverty by using agroecology alone. The agroecology methods that work at the project level usually don't scale up in the hands of actual farmers. Farmers don't take them up spontaneously because they're much too labor intensive. They can work if you have a captured labor force on a research station, but ordinary farmers don't have all the time in the world. They prefer to let more science do more of the work and spend less of their time hand gardening elaborately tended plots. So my book says, first of all, don't be afraid of agricultural science. But I'm less enthusiastic about modern food science, which has been used by food manufacturing companies to give us packaged, ultra-processed foods that can damage our health. My book explains the science of formulating foods with just the right combination of added sugars, salts, fat, texture, and processing to hit what's called the bliss point when it lands in the back of our mouth. When we eat an Oreo cookie or a Lay's potato chip, it triggers the reward circuit in our brain. We get a dopamine high, and this conditions us to crave those foods, even if we just see an image of them in an advertisement. We want to consume again. We're not satiated, especially if there's too much added sugar in a product. The companies also ultra-process foods, which induces us to eat too fast. So our stomach doesn't have time to tell our brain that it's full. In my book, I recount the results of a fascinating study where individuals were given the identical foods, but some in minimally processed forms and others in ultra-processed forms. Those given the foods in ultra-processed forms consumed on average 508 calories a day more. And that was correlated almost entirely with how fast they ate. They gained an average of something like 2 pounds a week because of the ultra-processing alone. And interestingly, they didn't say the foods tasted any better. It was simply an acceleration of their consumption, the speed of their eating. So in my book, I put considerable blame on modern food companies for America's recent crisis of dietary health. We have to remember that since the 1960s, obesity rates in the United States have tripled, bringing a high burden of chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, and stroke. Companies say this is not their fault, that they don't put the food in our mouths. It's a matter of personal responsibility on our part to eat a more healthy diet. But this doesn't make it with me. We're 3 times as obese as we were in the 1960s. Are we 3 times as personally irresponsible? I don't think so. I believe we're now trapped in a food environment that leads us toward excessive unstructured eating for many of us, no matter how hard we try to resist. Today, the problem in America is not that we're living in food deserts, it's that we're living in a food swamp consisting of virtually addictive but unhealthy processed foods. And in my book, I offer some policy remedies to start trying to drain that swamp. But that's my introduction. The book covers many more things. I'll be eager to get involved in a conversation with you and with Julie Howard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Yes, the book does cover so many more things. It's expansive in scope. It's thoroughly researched. It's well reasoned. It's informative, and I think that Julie and I both agree that it's enjoyable to read. And as it turns out, this was not an accident. At the end of the book, you note that you enlisted a writing coach to help write for a non-academic audience. You had editors and friends help you. And within the book, you talk about the importance of investing in communication, especially when speaking about science. So why was it so important to you to get communication right when it came to this book?
Well, this is actually the 10th book that I've written. But the others have been written either for other scholars or for a classroom audience. And I've grown frustrated over the years in not being able to reach a wider audience than that, with a message that I thought needed to be heard by those who've been reading the opposite about modern agriculture and food systems from so many prominent journalists and celebrity chefs and food critics. So I thought, well, okay, I should try to write a book that will be published by a trade publisher that will reach a wider audience. But I needed help in learning how to write that way. I was inspired in part by others that I had seen crossing this divide. One of my good friends is a rice scientist at the University of California, Davis, named Pamela Ronald, who is a prize-winning, locked down bench scientist. But she doesn't mind communicating with a wider audience, doing TED Talks, writing popular books, making presentations to large groups. She has her own program at Davis that teaches non-agricultural scientists about agricultural science and vice versa. She's taken a lot of criticism for her efforts to do this because she works on among other things, genetic engineering. So people think, oh, well, she's promoting GMOs. But no. Read her work carefully and appreciate the clarity with which she explains the risks and the benefits of crop biotechnology, and you'll be impressed. So I thought, well, I should, in part to honor efforts such as those she's made, I should try to do the same in my own sphere.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Robert. I had mentioned Julie, and I will introduce Julie Howard, who's joining me for today's discussion. Julie is a non-resident senior advisor with the CSIS Global Food Security Program, and Julie likewise brings decades of experience in agriculture, working for the U.S. government, in academia, and in civil society. So Julie, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'd like to turn to you for our first question.
Thank you, Caitlin. And Rob, I also want to offer thanks to you for this book. Congratulations on the book, really. And in my view, it's a vast territory. You cover so much in this book, but as Caitlin said, it's so very readable and accessible to ordinary people who may not be policy wonks. There are those people. So I think, also, especially in these days of minimalism and tweets and everything, condensed into 280 characters, I had the most luxurious feeling when I was reading your book. And I thank you for that. It felt like having a long conversation with a friend who I didn't always agree with, but a long and wonderful and important conversation. So thank you again. So Rob, I think, my perception of the book is that a lot of it is about correcting the record. And your initial comments sort of confirm that. You're reminding us in the book of the ways in which some of our food choices and our food politics has really become disconnected from evidence and from science. For example, your book reminds us of how genetically modified foods, GMOs, have been demonized, even though every major science academy and regulatory agency in the world has declared that GMOs are safe for human consumption and safe for the environment, yet they're banned in much of the world. And on organic foods, you point out, there's very little scientific evidence that the organic certification rules, that prohibit the use of GMOs, that prohibit the use of inorganic fertilizers and pesticides, that these rules really result in healthier foods or in more sustainable environmental practices. So what are we to make? I kept thinking through the book. So I felt like I was reliving a part of my career, really reading this book and the fights about science and technology. I kept thinking, so what do we do? What are the implications of your analysis as we go towards our future? And this year, as you know, is a particularly important year for agriculture. This year, the UN Food Systems Summit will take place in September. And it's really putting the spotlight on agriculture. And the summit is crystallizing what I see as a shift in thinking on agriculture and food security. The emerging view is that increasing agricultural productivity, which is really the topic of your book, what have we done over the past decades? Why was science and technology, why were the efforts to increase agricultural productivity so important during the Green Revolution? How do we understand that better? So the summit, though, and the larger, I think, field of agriculture and food security is thinking that's still very, very important. Yeah, our population is rising, but we also now have to think more about environmental sustainability and it's also about healthy diets. And on environmental sustainability, I think you're absolutely right to point out the advances that we've made with fertilizer, increased efficiency in fertilizer, increased efficiency of water use. But even with those improvements, as you know, really we're coming up against the limits of the planetary boundaries. So we have a lot of challenges. So my question to you is, what do you think are the lessons from your book for the food systems, and particularly the role of science and technology in meeting these multiple objectives now? So I think, science and technology are going to be more critical than ever to achieving these objectives. But how can we avoid the divisiveness that we've seen in the past and forge some kind of mutual understanding and a consensus that embraces science, but also acknowledges the validity of some of the concerns that are out there that got, I think, tied up and conflated in the discussion of the Green Revolution and industrial agriculture, some of those things that you discuss in your book, like increasing concentration. So what are the lessons from your book as we go forward into this new era?
Well, thanks, Julie. Those are helpful and very constructive comments. I would, if I were asked to give summary advice to the Food Systems Summit, I would say trust science for agricultural production. Draw a distinction between agricultural production and food product manufacturing. I know it's all a part of a single food system, but draw a distinction here between science and agricultural production and in food product manufacturing. In agricultural production, I'd say don't go back to pre-modern farming systems. Don't try to scale up that kind of agroecology. Add agroecological techniques to the beneficial results that we've seen from agricultural science over the years. You can pay more attention to the environmental gains from agricultural science. Address those directly with your interventions. That's something the original Green Revolution did not do, without abandoning the gains from science that were made in the Green Revolution, or without demonizing the Green Revolution, which unfortunately many advocates for agroecology often do. So I'd say try science for agricultural production, but be wary of what private companies are doing with modern food manufacturing science, and put some policy guardrails in place to protect tomorrow's consumers from the energy-dense, addictive, ultra-processed products that companies, often global companies headquartered in Europe and the United States, are sending into the food systems of developing countries where urbanization and income growth makes young people in particular vulnerable to the consumption of this kind of diet. In my book, I say there's some things you can do. You can put excise taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. You can require front of package nutrition guidance in not the kind of nutrition facts panel that we put on the side of food boxes in the United States. It's all fine print and small numbers, but symbols on the front of the package. In the UK, they have a voluntary system for red, yellow, and green lights that food buyers can see at a glance, and to help them stay away from things with too much sugar or too much salt. And put some restrictions on advertising food, especially to children. 18 European countries have embraced at least one of these three policy approaches, and obesity rates in Europe are only half as high as they are in the United States. So I would tell the Food Systems Summit to advise developing countries in particular to protect themselves from going down the path that too much of the United States has gone down. Don't let the food companies run wild. Put some guardrails there to protect you, and do it now before the food companies become such a dominant political force that they won't be able to, that you won't be able to impose these reforms on them. Set these policies in place now, and they won't. It won't be as much of a problem as it would be if you tried to put them in place later.
Great. Thanks. So I appreciate that. You know, I totally agree with you on the need to put stronger regulations in place, especially on advertising for children, and consider, you know, how we've gotten to the place that we've gotten to with ultra processed foods and the implications for our health. I'm planning to steal what you said, Rob. We're 3 times more obese. Does that mean we're 3 times more as irresponsible? I like that. I like that. So, but let me push back on you for a moment. So while agreeing with you on this importance of advertising and food manufacturing and focusing on that, both here in the U.S. and in low-income countries, I just want to ask you, beyond advertising, don't you think that agriculture, other kinds of agriculture and food policies, including subsidies, can play a much more significant and a normative role in shaping more environmentally sustainable and diverse food systems? I was looking at the 2018 Farm Bill last night and the spending. So about a third of spending on the last Farm Bill goes to the commodities, the big three, right? Corn, soy, and wheat. And about 1% goes to horticulture. Now it is increasing, but it's still 1% versus the third. So this isn't a discussion about the Farm Bill, thankfully, but doesn't that seem a little out of balance if we think we need to move towards healthier foods and diets, and we think we need to take another go really at a more environmentally sustainable production system, and one that's climate resilient. So can you talk a little bit more about some of the other policy and subsidy options that may be out there? Maybe increasing investment in agricultural research for underinvested commodities, maybe more and better investment in nutrition research, so we can kind of get away from the product of the day, the miracle blueberry, the miracle acai, et cetera. Decreasing risk for fruit and vegetable growers, encouraging the expansion of sustainable practices and protection of water, and even things like, things that get at consumer and behavior change that are not just advertising. For example, paying more attention to what goes into our school lunches or other institutional feeding programs, SNAP programs. So.
Yeah, good. That's an important comment. And when you mention agricultural subsidies, this gives me a chance to put forward a view that most people don't hear if they only read popular narratives about agricultural subsidies. But I believe agricultural economists would agree with me. I cite a number of them as agreeing with me in my book. The purpose of agricultural subsidies, both in the United States and in the European Union, is not to promote the production of more commodities. The purpose of the subsidies is to increase the income of farmers. It's a subsidy to the income of farmers. And the most convenient way to subsidize the income of farmers is often to make the commodities they produce artificially expensive, not artificially cheap. That's almost always the case. If you look at the sugar program in the United States, we use a tariff rate quota to keep inexpensive sugar from the world market out of the domestic U.S. market. And what that does is increase the price of sugar inside the U.S. market by 64%. So we're not subsidizing sugar, we're making it more expensive and harder to consume. We're subsidizing sugar growers in the United States by using import restrictions to protect them from their competition. Or look at wheat. We have a conservation reserve program that rents land from farmers for 10 years on the condition that they not grow any crops. The federal government pays wheat farmers in western Kansas a lot of money to leave their land idle for a 10-year period. Now, maybe this is good for conservation, but the original purpose and the effect to the present day is to reduce production of wheat and to drive up the price of wheat, which makes bread products artificially expensive, not artificially cheap. Or look at corn. Corn is the crop that people complain about the most. I think Michael Pollan said that because of farm subsidies, we're drowning in a plague of cheap corn. But that's not the way economists see what's really happening. We have a renewable fuel standard in the United States, an act of Congress that now mandates the use of more than 1/3 of our corn acreage for ethanol, for auto fuel. That takes all of that corn out of the food market completely and drives up the price of the corn that's remaining. So livestock producers, when they buy corn for their hogs, have to pay more for that corn. It's artificially expensive because of the ethanol program, not artificially cheap. And because corn and soybeans are grown on the same land, if you drive up the price of corn with an ethanol mandate, you'll also be driving up the price of soybeans because, well, you drive up the price of corn, people plant more corn on that land, so they plant fewer soybeans, so the price of soybeans goes up. So getting to fruits and vegetables, If we did what many people have suggested, subsidize fruits and vegetables instead of corn and soybeans, if we did it using the same instruments, which is to say import restrictions and production cutbacks and mandated use outside of the food market, the result wouldn't be cheaper fruits and vegetables. It would be more expensive fruits and vegetables and a worsening of the diet. Now, I try to explain this to students as clearly as I can and repeatedly, and I've tried to repeat all this again in my book. I don't expect to make too many instant converts, but I wanted to get the record out there because over the years, it's bothered me to hear that farm subsidies make food artificially cheap. I don't favor farm subsidies. I would like to get rid of most farm subsidies, but it's not because they make us fat. It's because it's a waste of the taxpayers' money. The subsidies go primarily to large growers who have a net worth and a household income substantially above that of the taxpayers that are paying for these subsidies. For me, it's wasteful and inequitable and poorly targeted. But and so I'd like to get rid of it, but it's not correct to say that it's a major source or even any source at all of our unbalanced or excessive eating.
So Rob, thanks for that. Just a quick follow-up on that. So anyway, our farm bill, our farm programs, what I take from that is that they're not fit for purpose right now. They're not. And so you don't want to take those same broken model and apply it to fruits and vegetables and other crops and expect a different result. But any quick thoughts on, well, what's the alternative, right? Instead of, from repeating the problematic approach in another sector, what could be, some things that some glimmers of hope, maybe. I hope you got some while you were researching and writing the book. What might we think about pursuing as an alternative?
Yeah, well, one thing I mentioned in my book is some reform, some nutrition targeting in our food stamp program, the SNAP program. I mean, we spend much more on the SNAP program than we spend on farm subsidies. It's the biggest part of the Department of Agriculture's budget. It's a very important and a valuable program to help low-income households. It's one of the few entitlement programs that's actually targeted toward low-income Americans. I'm a big supporter of the SNAP program, but I think we could do a better job by removing some items from eligibility for purchase using SNAP benefits. You can buy sugar-sweetened beverages with SNAP benefits. You can buy candy with SNAP benefits. I wouldn't reduce the dollar value of the benefit one bit, but I would like to see if the nutrition of SNAP recipients might improve if they had to spend their own money instead of taxpayers' money to purchase sugar-sweetened beverages. Now, this was proposed by a bipartisan policy council in Washington, D.C. that was chaired by two former secretaries of agriculture, one a Democrat and one a Republican. It was supported by the American Heart Association, but it didn't get anywhere in the 2018 Farm Bill. It was predictably, it was attacked from the political right by the American Beverage Association. The soda lobby didn't want any part of this, but it was also resisted by Democrats who, the so-called hunger lobby, which doesn't want to place any restrictions at all on the SNAP program as it currently exists. They simply want it to be expanded. And my view is that this was a legitimate position to take back in the 1970s when the hunger lobby got started. But today, with obesity rates above 42% in the country, and with low-income households, including SNAP recipients, also suffering from high obesity rates, some nutrition targeting in this program. We have nutrition targeting in the WIC program. We have nutrition requirements in the federal school lunch program. I think it's time to add some nutrition targeting to the SNAP program as well.
Great. Thank you, Robert. I'd like to take the conversation in a little bit of a different direction, coming back to your focus on the Green Revolution. And I believe that Julie might have some follow-up questions on Green Revolution topics. So my question has to do with something that you've already mentioned, which is high rates of urbanization in developing countries and how to help make sure that developing countries don't go the way that developed countries have gone when it comes to dietary diseases. In your book, you give ample attention to rural poverty and hunger, and to a green revolution type approach to reducing poverty and food insecurity in rural areas. And I know that you wrote and you've spoken about Ethiopia, about the case of Ethiopia, where, as you mentioned, 80% of the population are still living in rural areas and engaging in farming. For countries like Tanzania, it's still about 70%. There are other very populous countries in Africa where rural populations are smaller and urban populations are growing. So, for example, in Nigeria, it's over 50% of Nigeria's population live in urban areas. It's 2/3 of South Africa's population, 56% of Ghana's population, et cetera. So for a number of populous countries in Africa, for all countries in Africa, urbanization is growing, and for a number of them, urbanization rates are already very high. To assume that urbanization automatically brings prosperity and food security misses the mark. And I think that that's an assumption that a lot of people in the food security community can make. So for example, a recent World Bank report found that in every country where urbanization rates were over 75%, there were more people living in poverty in urban areas than rural areas. And the same report says that the number of urban poor may exceed the number of rural poor within this decade. So for food insecure populations living in urban areas, I think that a green revolution type approach would deliver some benefits, but not immediate solutions. And I'm wondering if you could discuss what solutions you think global donors should promote to address food insecurity among food insecure populations in cities in developing countries, with an eye to what we've already discussed, which is this new food systems approach that we'll be thinking more about as the summit approaches.
Great, Caitlin. That's a wonderful question, and you're right. Urbanization is the future for eventually even for Ethiopia and Tanzania. There's no doubt about it. I guess I'd have two comments. One would be to notice that rapid urbanization often is a result of rural poverty. If farmers can't make money in agriculture, they leave. Often the women stay back to tend the land and raise the kids, and the men go to town, where they hope to pick up jobs in the informal economy. They may send remittances back to their rural family, or they may visit periodically in order to participate in some planting season tasks. But the pull of the city is often a push away from the impoverishment of farming. So if you want to slow the flood of poor people into cities, and most urban poor were poor when they arrived. If you want to slow the movement of poor people into cities, I think you need to invest more in agriculture. We saw in Latin America over the years landless peasants who couldn't prosper in the terribly inequitable farming systems of Central America and South America. They went to the urban and the peri-urban slums, and they looked for jobs as day laborers or as maids, and remained desperately poor. And of course, the way to bring the urban poor out of poverty is to launch industrial job creation, and a number of Asian countries have done that successfully. I think most recently Bangladesh. Bangladesh used to be the poster child for rural poverty, but now, in part because of the garment industry and other light manufacturing, job creation in urban areas, and income growth in urban areas is prominent, and stunting and malnutrition in Bangladesh have come down sharply. So there are ways to urbanize rapidly without worsening your dietary circumstances. Where the urban poor aren't getting adequate job opportunities, there are things that governments can and should do. And I like conditional cash transfer programs that deliver cash benefits often to mothers with children, on the condition that the children attend school and go to clinics to get medical attention. These programs put money in the hands of poor households while ensuring adequate investments in the health and education of the next generation. You're not going to get a good job in the urban economy today if you're unhealthy and illiterate. And the conditional cash transfer programs. Brazil, of course, did wonders with these kinds of programs. Mexico did so sooner. I would like to see these programs expand in urban areas.
Thank you very much. Just one question for clarification before I turn to Julie. Making agriculture more productive and more efficient and more profitable didn't necessarily keep more people in rural areas in more developed countries. So would we expect it to do that in developing countries in the longer term?
Well, when agriculture became more productive and more profitable in the United States, it allowed rural households who had, at the time in the early 20th century, household incomes only 2/3 as high as non-rural households. It allowed those households to require less labor on the farm so that children could stay in school, get an education, and then take a job in the urban economy. Fortunately, at that time, we had industrial growth in the urban economy, and so those who left the farm earned more money as a result. And when they left the farm, all the little small farms started consolidating into larger farms. They could afford machinery, they could afford improved technology, their productivity went up, and their income and net worth went up as well. So you had a win at both ends of the labor migration at that time. Fortunately, as I say, we had an urban economy that was experiencing rapid industrial growth, so it could work well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Rob, thanks for that. I want to continue on the urban theme and pick your brain on a couple of things. So I think 6 years ago, I would have been in your camp. Yeah, I would have agreed with you. Yeah, let's try and stem the flow of people to urban areas, making rural areas more attractive, et cetera, et cetera. But in so many ways, I think that's unrealistic. I think there's such a flood, of people. The pace of urbanization is increasing far more rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa than I think we had anticipated. So, and I have to say, I have been waiting, since graduate school days, with great anticipation for the Industrial Revolution to take place in sub-Saharan Africa and for those promised jobs, that we read about in graduate school textbooks to materialize, so that as we were becoming more efficient, as we are becoming more efficient and productive in sub-Saharan African agriculture, the people who were released from their labor would have something to go to. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah, I mean, this seems to be a case that we're becoming more efficient and productive in a kind of jobless way. There's nothing for people to go to, and I find that deeply troubling. And other colleagues will note that I've become a pest. Asking people, do we need to change the way we're thinking about, Hayami Rutan? Maybe there isn't, maybe there isn't a rainbow out there, and really, Africa is going to need to follow its own path, or it's going to be a delayed path. So that's one dimension. What do we do about this seeming, the problems with industrialization, the lack of jobs, and still, the flow of people, particularly young people, to the cities. And that relates to the second dimension of my question. So, we started seeing, as you know, the uptick of hunger again, after many years of progress in global hunger. Even before COVID-19, hunger was increasing again. Well, where is hunger increasing? It's increasing in fragile, conflict-affected countries, in countries that, in many cases, the conditions are made worse, by climate. So you've got that friction. You've got people, in many cases, going to camps, but more often going to margins of cities or communities. And, in my mind, I always thought, well, okay, they're there for a short time. They're not there for a short time. Yeah, they're often there for years. They're often establishing. So what are we to do? So those people can feed themselves, and so that they have some productive means for some income. So that's where I've been on the alert. For what kind of intensive agriculture is possible? There's quite a lot actually in horticulture. There's also quite a lot in intensive small animal production. A lot that you can do, and there are lots of job possibilities. And we're seeing, the larger cities in Africa, youth gravitate towards, urban and peri-urban opportunities, not only production, but throughout the value chain. So, I know, that this is still a relatively small piece, of our production needs, our food needs. But I'm wondering, for me, I'm seeing, is there a glimmer there? Should we begin to think about this urban challenge as an urban opportunity, and begin to shape our policies and investments a little bit differently?
Okay, that opens up a lot, and I can't possibly cover all of those good questions. One thing occurred to me when you mentioned higher value crops and small animals. You're right, that's a good pathway out of poverty for people who are in agriculture in Africa today. But often what you need to succeed along that pathway is a guaranteed water supply. And almost none of African agriculture is irrigated outside of North Africa and outside of the Republic of South Africa. Why? Well, it's not because they lack water. Africa has groundwater resources. It has water aquifers galore, and they are essentially untapped. Why? It's because governments have not made any investments in small-scale irrigation to speak of. They haven't paid for the boreholes or the pumps or the small-scale irrigation infrastructure, and so African farmers remain rain-fed, and if they don't have water, they're not going to buy fertilizer or hybrid seeds, because if there's a drought, their investment will be wasted. So we need more investments in African agriculture from governments in Africa. Now here, I like to blame donors for not doing enough, but we have to be candid about the underperformance of governments in Africa. In 2003, the African heads of government met at an AU summit, and they knew they weren't investing enough in agriculture. So they pledged by 2008, they would be spending 10% of their public budget on agriculture, which wasn't a lot. I mean, India during the Green Revolution was spending 20% of its public budget on agriculture, and they got results. But the African governments who made this pledge, with very few exceptions, failed to meet the pledge. 2008 came and went, and the average investment of governments in agriculture remained around 5%, not 10%. And remember, this is for the sector of the economy that employs 60% or more of their citizens. What do they spend their money on? They spend too much of their money unfortunately, on the urban population, employing civil servants in vast ministries that don't really do a lot of work, paying the army, paying the police, protecting urban industrialists. It's an urban biased economy that has starved the countryside. And until that changes, I don't see the opportunities that are waiting in agriculture being seized very far. Now, why, with this urban bias, why haven't urban industries sprung up? Well, it turns out that these African governments have traditionally been, there are exceptions now, but many of them have been, including Tanzania, deeply distrustful of private companies. They make private investment difficult. First, they don't provide public goods. If you're a private company in an African city, you may not have a reliable power supply. The roads might be a mess. Property rights aren't protected. There's no physical security. In order to get a license to do anything, and you need licenses to do everything in Africa, you may have to pay a bribe. You may not be able to get. You may not be able to import the parts that you need because trade is so restricted. African governments have historically been almost as unfriendly to private urban industry as they've been to rural agriculture. I know it's impolitic to say these things, but I, like you, have been waiting for decades to see the needle move, and with very few exceptions. And Ghana is one clear exception. With very few exceptions, many African governments are still cutting themselves out of the future by creating unfriendly environments, both for smallholder farming and for urban industrial growth. Governments in Africa became accustomed to earning foreign exchange by mining or producing petroleum. They're resource rich, and they use those resources in order to earn foreign exchange and to pay government workers in the capital city, but not to reinvest in private sector economic growth.
Great. Well, we probably need another session to talk about industrial policy. So thanks for your comments on that. I would add Ethiopia to that list. I think Ethiopia has really done a 180 on its attitude toward the private sector and encouraging private sector investments. So that'll be a very interesting place to watch with Ghana. I think, we're running out of time, I know, Caitlin, but I wanted just to touch briefly on the impacts of COVID-19. Yeah. And so I think in your book, even though it was published so recently, you do have some comments about the impact of COVID-19, especially in the U.S. And I think you're a little pessimistic about whether there will be any lasting impact. That people are doing a lot of online ordering of food. They are doing more cooking, but not necessarily healthy cooking, not necessarily ordering healthier food. So you're thinking there's not a great change that's going to lead to healthier diets. But I'm wondering, if you think the same thing about the impact of COVID-19 in low-income countries. So, from my perhaps rosy perspective, I have seen a much swifter uptake of technologies, advanced technologies like information and communication technology, just because, with lockdowns and transportation difficulties and, difficulties of doing things as you normally would in a face-to-face way, farmers and transporters and market people and food services are more and more embracing information and communication technologies to do their deal, and seeing the possibilities of access to banking services, for example. So those things, which I think have been lying latent for a long time and still require lots of investment, like Like here, broadband in the U.S., broadband is an issue. Of course, access remains a huge issue in low-income countries. But are you seeing that as a bright spot? Way we might be able to leapfrog ahead the silver lining of COVID.
Well, I hope so. And certainly we've seen in the United States technologies, including Zoom webinars that were seldom used, are now pervasive. And my guess is in the academic world where I come from, we're not going to go all the way back to the very costly get your body into the room face-to-face interactions that seemed to be necessary before. We've learned that they're not necessary, and I expect we'll see some same leapfrogging in the food and farming sectors of developing countries. I mean, already Africa has leapfrogged the need for telephone poles in the cell phone era. My guess is they'll find ways to take advantage of ICT during and following the pandemic as well. I'm probably not as optimistic as you are. Maybe it's because I see what's happened in the United States. The shutdowns put the food service sector in the tank. People had to suddenly provision themselves and their families at home, and they sacrificed healthy eating for comfort and convenience. Frozen pizza purchases increased as much as 50% during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. You're right, people did a little more food preparation at home, but it was mostly baking cookies and bread. And meanwhile, children lost access to healthy school lunch meals. It's been a downslide for dietary health in the United States, and I saw one study that showed that the number of people who shopped at farmers markets declined 59% during the summer of 2020 due to the pandemic. So I'm sure there's a silver lining somewhere, but for dietary health purposes, it's so far been a little hard for me to find.
Thank you. I'd like to continue on this theme on impacts of COVID, particularly on food supply chains. So turning to your book, I think your book does an excellent job of explaining why local food is not a sustainable model for agriculture and food security. In fact, it's unsustainable economically and environmentally speaking. During this pandemic, though, we've seen a lot of critiques of U.S. Food supply chains as being too long and also too efficient from the very beginning of the pandemic. From its onset until just a few weeks ago, when there was an op-ed by Michael Pollan in the Washington Post talking about, criticizing the efficiency of our food supply chains and arguing for investing in diversifying supply chains. And in this op-ed, he says that farmers may need different kinds of machinery. There's a price to diversity, but this creates a cushion that can be very important in times of crisis. So can you do the same thing with this argument that you did with other arguments in your book? What's your take on this?
Well, my book was written almost entirely before COVID. So these are thoughts that have occurred to me since the manuscript was sent to the publisher. But I don't share the conclusion that COVID has revealed our food system to be brittle and unreliable. Look at agricultural trade. It hasn't been interrupted. It was interrupted more by President Trump's needless trade war with China than it has been by COVID. U.S. agricultural exports and imports continued to increase in 2020. Some meat processing, pork processing, was briefly interrupted by workforce infections, but overall in 2020, pork production in the United States was higher than it had been during the average of the previous 5 years. The only part of our system that broke down was the food service sector, restaurants and and school lunch meals. But that wasn't a result of COVID. That was a result of unprecedented government requirements that this sector go into a complete lockdown. And much of the feared food insecurity from the loss of income, from the shutdown of restaurants, has been buffered by the expansion of our SNAP program and our other safety net programs. I don't see the food calamity that others claim to have seen. As for the pollen suggestion that we'd be better off if we diversified our farming systems, I think he mentioned it might be good for farmers to grow not one or two crops, but as many as 10 crops and raise animals at the same time. And that would spread their risks. I don't see it that way. Maybe it's my personal history. My grandfather's farm in Indiana did grow 10 different crops and raised 5 different kinds of animals. And he did it because back then people thought, oh, well, this is the best way to reduce your risk. The problem was it didn't generate much income because of all the labor that was required. My grandfather, his spouse, and his 4 young sons, healthy young sons, worked all the time. My dad delayed his college education so he could stay on the farm to help out. They worked all the time. And during the Depression, they had a negative return on their income. So there wasn't any resilience there. I think we accept specialization in the rest of our economy. It didn't fail us during COVID. I see no reason to return to the full diversification, the labor-intensive full diversification that Pollen is describing. Remember, the diversified farms that we had in the past had households that were poorer, substantially poorer than the non-farming households. I don't know who wants to go back to that. I doubt that many people want to go back to that kind of poverty today.
Well, thank you. So it sounds like you would not recommend as a broad scale policy, intentionally diversifying or intentionally investing in making our food supply chains less efficient. When it comes to, sorry, go ahead.
I could just add one observation. I mean, I live in New England, and New England has large numbers of small, local, diversified farms. Many of them are organically certified. They often sell through farmers markets or CSAs or directly to restaurants. It looks like an appealing model until you consider how little food these farms produce. If you look at every single farm, large and small, in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine put together, their total farm sales are only 1% of all national farm sales. So we have to be realistic about this. Gets back to the amount of production that the market is calling for today. We have to be realistic about ways that we can produce food sustainably, but also in adequate abundance.
Thank you. So we are approaching time, and again, on this theme of policy recommendations or things that you wouldn't recommend, you do at the end of your book collect recommendations you had made throughout, particularly as they relate to improving diets within the United States. I don't think that you anticipated this book being published when it was, still in the middle of a pandemic, at the outset of the Biden administration, the same year that the first ever UN Food Systems Summit will be held. So this is a really important time for the domestic and global food security community. This year, when the final assessments come out, I'm predicting that we'll see the highest rates of food insecurity in the United States in decades, and globally, probably in at least a decade. So again, very important time for this book in particular. And beyond the policy recommendations that you do list toward the end of your book, what recommendations would you make for the Biden administration regarding what you view as our most pressing food security challenges?
Okay, I would tell the Biden administration to absolutely continue to focus on safety nets to ensure food security during COVID. It's an economic crisis, not just a public health crisis. But I would note that we now have a vaccine, and we will probably be coming out of the public health crisis during President Biden's first term. And when we do, we will find ourselves staring again at a longer-term public health crisis, one that will probably have worsened during COVID, and that's increasing obesity with unbalanced and excessive food consumption, leading to heavy burdens of chronic disease. So I would tell President Biden to get ready to channel his internal Michelle Obama and make another attempt at moving the country toward healthy eating. I would tell him to instruct the Food and Drug Administration to promulgate guidelines for front of package nutrition guidance. I would tell him to encourage more municipal governments to enact excise taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. I tell him to promote at least voluntary federal standards, limiting the advertising of junk foods to children. And in the next Farm Bill, I would tell him to please at least launch a pilot study to learn what nutrition improvements might come out of restricting soda purchases through the SNAP program. That would be my post-COVID public health agenda, focusing on dietary health.
Thank you. Well noted. Julie, I'd like to turn to you for a final question or final comment.
Well, Rob, you've given us so much to think about. I think we're going to need another whole conversation about this specialization versus diversification issue. I think, being optimistic, I think that no good crisis should be wasted. And we certainly have a number of crises that face us right now. So it's not only the pandemic, it's also climate change, the need for resilience. It's also environmental sustainability. So I really don't see, in such stark terms that specialization is the only way to go to get us the food that we need, because I think it's clearly, I think it's part of the issue right now. Yeah, is that we're so focused on corn, soy, wheat, meat. So without abandoning the gains of specialization, how do we approach it and say, well, what other pathways may get us to healthier diets and more sustainable environmentally sustainable agriculture? So I think we have some thinking to do there. And on back to Michelle Obama. I do think, advertising, regulating advertising is very much a part of the equation, but also the power of role modeling, which Michelle Obama did so and continues to do so well. It means something, to have the first Black First Lady planting a vegetable garden and shopping in farmers markets. Now you can argue, and I think you do argue, that that's such a tiny portion, of our food system. Farmers markets and home vegetable gardens can't possibly sustain us. And you're absolutely right. But I think about the children, who take in the messages in a different way when they come from Michelle Obama or when they see their parents, actively involved in vegetable gardening. And I think, we need to think a little bit harder about some of those issues. But Caitlin and Rob, just finally, Rob, I just want to thank you again for this wonderful contribution, this gift of your book. And I just want to be on record as completely agreeing with the New York Times that this is indeed a new and noteworthy book. And I suspect and I hope that it's going to become required reading, not only for students, but for everybody who cares about food systems in the past, but also in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate those words.
Great, thank you. And I think that that's a perfect place to end our discussion. Again, each topic we touched on could merit its own unique event. So we hope to continue conversations with you on all these things, Robert, and wish you best of luck with your book. Thank you.
Okay, my agent told me I should be sure to mention the title of my book at least 3 times. So I'm going to mention at least one more time. It's titled Resetting the Table, Straight Talk About the Food We Grow and Eat. And thank you, Caitlin, and thanks to CSIS for helping me launch the book.